Hello and welcome. Today, we're going to get into a really important distinction for anyone studying media or criminology. We're talking about the difference between a moral panic and a newer concept that researcher Sarah Moore calls the cautionary tale. If you're someone who analyzes how crime gets reported, this is a brand new and I think vital tool for your analytical toolkit. So, let's dive in.
So let's kick things off with a pretty fundamental question. Whenever we see the media get into a frenzy about some kind of crime or social issue, is that automatically a moral panic? I mean, we hear that term a lot, right? But is it always the right label for what's actually happening?
You know, this isn't exactly a new problem. Way back in 1995, researchers McRobbie and Thornton pointed this out, this tendency we have to just slap the moral panic label on basically any media scare. The real danger there is that when we overuse the term, it starts to lose its meaning, and it might even blind us to what's really going on beneath the surface. It's pretty clear we need a more refined way of looking at things. And that is exactly where Sarah Moore's work becomes so valuable. She puts forward this alternative framework, this different lens, called the cautionary tale. Now, the idea here isn't to throw out the concept of moral panic altogether. Not at all. It's about adding another essential tool that helps us understand the full picture. Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to do a quick refresher on what a classic moral panic looks like. Then, we'll get into the specifics of the cautionary tale. After that, we'll put them side by side to see how they each try to regulate our behavior. Then, we'll explore why these cautionary tales seem to be everywhere today. And we'll wrap it all up by talking about what this new perspective really means for media analysis.
All right. Section 1. Before we can really grasp what the cautionary tale is, we've got to be absolutely solid on the classic concept it's in conversation with, the moral panic.
So at its heart, a moral panic is all about identifying an external threat. It points its finger at a specific group, the so-called folk devil, and paints them as this major danger to society's values. You know, think of the classic examples like the mods and rockers, or the fear over horror movies. The whole point is to direct control outwards, onto this supposedly deviant group. And now, for Section 2. Here's where we get into Moore's alternative idea, which honestly, it completely flips the script. Instead of looking for an external folk devil, the cautionary tale turns its gaze inward. And right away, you can see this massive shift in focus. The cautionary tale isn't really about the criminal. Instead, the narrative zeroes in on the victim, or even just the potential victim. All of a sudden, it's their choices, their behaviors, and whether or not they took enough precautions that become the center of the story. So let's break down its key features. First, it is totally victim-centric. The threat is framed as coming from two places at once: the external criminal, sure, but also the internal poor judgment of the victim. And unlike the big, explosive nature of a moral panic, these stories are usually slow burns. They pop up everywhere: news reports, dramas, talk shows. They're less about a crime that already happened, and more about preventing some potential crime in the future, often by putting the behavior of women, specifically, under a microscope. Okay, so now we have our two frameworks on the table. This brings us to the real heart of the analysis here in Section 3, a head-to-head comparison. Let's really dig into how these function as two totally different approaches to moral regulation.
And this table just lays out the difference so clearly. In a moral panic, who's under the microscope? The folk devil, that outsider group. The whole mechanism is blaming them, and the call to action is always for more social control over them. But now, look at the cautionary tale. The target of scrutiny completely shifts to the victim. The mechanism becomes a kind of victim blaming, or analyzing their choices as flawed. And the call to action? It's not about controlling outsiders. It's about individuals' self-regulation. It's about you controlling yourself.
So that brings us to a really critical question in Section 4. Why are we seeing this victim-focused story so much more these days? Well, to answer that, we have to look at the kind of society we're living in, the social soil where these tales grow. And the answer really lies in what sociologists call our risk society. The scholar Alan Hunt pointed out that more and more we don't really talk about morality directly anymore. Instead, we talk about it through these proxies, or stand-ins, and the big ones are harm and risk. These have become the modern languages we use to talk about right and wrong.
And that's what makes the cautionary tale a perfect media form for a society that is just obsessed with managing risk. It completely reframes the idea of personal safety. It's no longer a collective responsibility, but this personal project where every single one of us has to be constantly managing our own risk.
Sarah Moore herself connects these dots perfectly.
She basically argues that the cautionary tale demands that we're always looking inward, reflecting on our actions, looking to the future to spot threats, and then doing everything we can to mitigate them. And that is the exact logic of a modern risk society in a nutshell.
So, let's wrap this all up. What's the main thing we should be taking away from this whole discussion?
I think the single most important thing to remember is that the cautionary tale isn't here to replace the moral panic. It's an absolutely essential second tool for our analytical toolkit. Some media events are still classic moral panics, no doubt, but many others are cautionary tales. And if we really want to understand how media shapes our views on crime and behavior, we need to be able to use both.
And I'll just leave you with one final question to think about. What does it really mean for us, as a society, when our stories about crime become less about what the perpetrator did and more about the precautions the victim failed to take? It signals a really profound shift in who we believe is responsible for keeping people safe, and it's something well worth thinking about.